One of the most fascinating sources to read if you study the work of Beethoven is, of course, Anton Schindler's biography. It's a little bit controversial at the same time, talk about that in a minute. But Schindler is not writing only about the life of Beethoven, but giving us also insight in possibly how Beethoven played. At least that's how he describes that. I have two versions of his biography. This is the English one. That's translated in 1840 and edited by Moschles, not translated but edited. So Moschles gives very interesting in the translation, since they were not allowed to make changes in the translation. That was explicitly asked by Schindler, which was kind of weird at those days. Can you imagine how different their approach was? So Moschles' solution is then to give, on the request of the editor, in footnotes his comment on Schindler's biography, which is interesting because Schindler is commenting on Beethoven. He was a genius in making enemies, and that's kind of the spirit today. We, the musicology research, is not very friendly to Schindler, and he became one of those people that whatever he writes, nobody believes him, which is kind of silly, I believe. But anyway, this is the latest edition, the fourth edition, I believe, 1871. So beautiful print also. This is in German again. You see, hope you see it. Anyway, we're going to cover a short passage here about the Opus 14 number 2, which I think is really close, could be, might have been really close to how Beethoven played. That's at least what Schindler wants us to believe. Today, those quotes are really heavily debated, and actually not debated anymore. There is a common understanding amongst musicologists and many performers as well, which is a little bit of pity, that whatever Schindler writes about Beethoven is by definition not true. Certainly not on the Opus 14, and also on the 7th Symphony, which are passages he added later in the Notizen by Beethoven. You know, the Notizen are the little sketchbooks that Beethoven carried along with him, where people would write the questions they had for him, so he could, if it wasn't a day that he didn't hear very well, and at the end of his life he was almost completely deaf, that they could communicate with him. There is only few answers by Beethoven, just like a telephone call that you only hear one voice. But Schindler has been accused of having destroyed over 200 of those books, and still today that's something that lives on and on forever, even in the recent publications like from Barry Cooper. Actually, Barry Cooper in his Beethoven Compendium corrects that in a sense, but not completely, because it's a bit like with Forkel, who has given so much information on J.S. Bach, but it's not always in line with what we today believe it's true, and the easiest way, of course, is to reject everything. But as Barry Cooper honestly is writing, that probably there might be a case scenario that not so many of those books, of those sketchbooks, are lost. It might just have been a mistranslation by a gentleman named Tyre, who was one of the late 19th century, early 20th century, I believe, Beethoven researchers who wrote or mistranslated a letter of Schindler, where he says, I have viel über 100 of these Skizzen. He translated as more than 400, but it actually says way over 100, and Schindler sold 137, if I remember correct, of these books to the Berlin Museum, National Museum, where they still are, of Beethoven's notation books, and that might have been all. But still the narrative lives that he has destroyed much evidence. He did add some passages later, but remember this, and that's always the case with contextual evidence. If Schindler wouldn't have taken those books, nobody would have cared about them. We would not have them at all. And even in 1839 or 1840, when he publishes his biography, he was the first, can you imagine that, more than 10 years after Beethoven's death, that who was studying the work of that master, who was playing it. So I can imagine also a scenario where Schindler is sitting in his study room, reflecting upon the heritage he had from Beethoven. After all, he lived for years in Beethoven's house together with him. as an unpaid secretary, that from his memory he just added some passages in those sketchbooks to preserve it. Today, musicologists say, well, don't pay attention to those because they are not genuine, they are not original. Might be the case, but they're written by Schindler, and if only reflect his approach, why wouldn't we don't care about it? But it could have been also that he was just preserving his memories from getting lost. And if there was an empty space in the diaries, he would use that. He might as well have written carefully, as we would him to expect to do today, that he has added that later, but maybe he didn't care. He also wrote names with in the sketchbooks from the people who were talking or writing, and he was also accused, and still today, of making up stories, but in fact many of those names turned to be right. Some were wrong, but hey, that's over many years that he was challenging his memory, so maybe he didn't do it on purpose. Might be the case after all. Anyway, that's my take on those things. I'm going to read you some passages and play for you about the Opus 14. He made a piece about the Opus 14 number 1, which you're going to cover next month, and now about the Opus 14 number 2. He starts by saying that those two sonatas in his time are amongst the least known, which is unfortunately because they are really beautiful pieces. And in fact, he also says that those pieces are considered to be easy pieces to play, which today still is kind of the case. In conservatory, you're giving these pieces at the beginning of your education because technically they are not so demanding. But in fact, they are really difficult. I've made a masterclass live on that. It's an extensive diving into this first part. Link it here if you're interested in that. Schindler is writing about the two subjects. He's been accused that that's not Beethoven's way of composing, but I can't believe it's true. I mean, it's just two principles. He says he says you have two voices, you have two different opinions, you have two different, how is he calling that? He's a husband and a wife arguing with each other. So there you have the first theme, just very briefly. So both these sonatas have for their subject a dialogue between a husband and wife, or a lover and his mistress. And we don't like that today because we like the idea of the abstract music that's just pure. But in those days, music had a meaning, had an imagination. And so it shouldn't surprise us that also for that music, it was a common practice. So the opposition of the two principal parts being more sensible marked than in the first sonata, in this one in the G major. By these two parts, Beethoven intended to represent two principles which he designated the entreating and the resisting. That's really, really true. We've talked about it in the masterclass as well. I didn't even know before, but that between brackets. Even in the first bars, the contrary motion marks the opposition of these principles. We're going to play that. I'm going to switch off the shotgun microphone so you will hear my voice now a little bit more roomy through the microphone, so the Neumanns. So the resistance is in the left hand, accentuating the second eighth note, keeping the theme from. So, and then he continues. You have to, if you're interested, it's easy to find the English translation of Schindler's biography. It's in the English translation, page 153. And then in bar 8, there is a principal theme alone. So they're a little bit fighting here. And then there's a calm. So there is a principal theme getting all the space that voice needs to have his or her story developed. So that continues a little bit. More interesting for us is the way Beethoven played that, or those are the words of Schindler. At least Schindler would have liked us to play that. And what he's talking about is also something we've talked about, covered in the masterclass, about the tempo rubato. It's not like in Chopin when you have a timeline, so it kind of accept your tempo, so to say, whatever that is, and you deflect from that. Also in Chopin's time, it was not like we I think it's not, you cannot, in piano class we were taught with Chopin rubato you can do everything you want. That's not the case. But in Beethoven you have still this line certainly, and go underneath and you go out, you go above that. Czerny has written in his Opus 500 Part 3 piano school extensively about the tempo rubato. Remember that's 1839, that's way much later, it's 40 years later than this sonata, so you have to keep in mind that people were evolving as well as performers, looking back, but still children of their time, even Czerny. But the tempo rubato he describes, and there is really fascinating, is the same as here. So Schindler basically says that Beethoven is not using a kind of steady tempo, it's not deflecting too much of that line of tempo, but sudden enough, so subtle enough, that's what I want to say, to make the changes, to make the contrast bigger and less. So let's dive into this a little bit, just touching about some elements. And Schindler writes, Beethoven really wanted other people to play like that. This Madame Erdmann, who was one of the famous Beethoven performances, and also a house concert held at Karl Czerny's house. Schindler says he was a master of that, and that makes these pieces difficult because they really require this. So he commenced the opening allegro with vigor and spirit, relaxing these qualities at the 6th bar and in the following passages, just giving an impression. So I can imagine more than I did if you read that he just had a little bit more of moving onwards. I leave the music as it is, but vigor, going onwards. Coming to a calm. And then preparing with a slight rubato, ritardando, as Schindler writes, this theme, which works. So here a slight ritardando made preparation for gently introducing the entrating principle, which we did now. The performance of the phrase was exquisitely shaded, and to the following bars, which are the Beethoven's manner of holding down particular notes combined with a kind of soft gliding touch imparted such a vivid coloring that the hearer could fancy he actually beheld the lover in his living form and heard him apostrophizing his obdurate mistress. And that's something, again, I've talked about that, it's obvious if you play that, and that has to do with the tempo because it allows you to do, if you have not a too high tempo, to hold certain notes and to make them really, the left hand is giving you the pulse to continue. Also with emphasizing, as I do, I think with the second 8th note, so the third 16. It's giving you this movement that you want to go on. But the right hand is really long notes, very cantabile, like an opera singer. So if you really imagine this holding position, this hand position of Beethoven, which only works on the piano. You cannot do that on the clavichord, but they try to imitate. So this really deep in the tone, a little bit too late, 18th century rubato approach. They might have something like that. Slowing down movement in the right hand, contrary to the left hand that wants to push you. So those are again those two elements. Then in this passage, Schindler continues, Beethoven strongly accentuated the 4th, 16th of those triples. On counter accents, if you consider this just to be an old-fashioned 2/4 with 2 quarter notes that needs an accent, and in between you have the 8 notes, so just counting in 4 in 2 instead of 4, then these accents make no sense because you have counter accents. But if, yeah, they make a sense, but they're a little bit against nature, because you would have if you speed up the tempo a little bit. But if you go down in 4/8, so that works perfectly. And again, if you turn the things around, that's the way I look to it. And I'm going to wrap up this video because it's getting too long. As interesting it also is, maybe just a few passages now. But if you turn the things around and you step in our modern performances of this piece, then these performances guidance don't work all the time, because it feels unnatural having that accent if you play it way faster. But that's all the thing, that's all it is about. Reconstructing the context, and again, that's my context, just my world here. Then this becomes very natural, and it becomes very applicable as well. So I think that's interesting. So of course he's writing about then the passages here, that you have the melody, and Beethoven strongly emphasized the melody that you obviously had against the syncopation in the alt voice or tenor voice. And then when the bass came, we talk about that in the masterclass. This is of course very beautifully accentuated then. And how these two came together again at the end. Also here in the last thing that he mentions, so we are almost there, that let's see where that is. So right before the returning of the first part, you have this passage here. It's almost Debussy. So Schindler writes here. He introduced the phrases. Then in the second part, and that's just 2 more elements to wrap this video up. The phrase in A flat, he made a little bit ritardando of the 2 preceding bars, and then he attacked this phrase vigorously, thus diffusing a glow of color over the picture, which is also something, I'm sorry to repeat, but I demonstrated that in the masterclass as well. It's obvious also from the music. So you have these bars, the crescendo, flat is out of tune for that. But anyway, that's of course within the music. You slow down a little bit, and then the contrast is really big. And then the subtleness, he gave a charming expression to the following phrase in the treble by strongly accentuating and holding down longer than the prescribed time the first note in each bar, which he means by this. This kind of let's just tune that because I cannot stand it. It's a kind of Debussy sound. And then here, that's Beethoven held these notes longer than prescribed. The contrast with the 32nd note. So it's just a snapshot. There's a lot to be said about Schindler, so I apologize for these longer videos because we need to open a little bit our minds, I think, also for the valuable information that's in there. People have researched that and we know what he added later, but that's not telling anything about the truthfulness that he's writing about. So I think we should give those people a second chance because it's mind-blowing to see. Imagine just if this was very short to Beethoven, very close to Beethoven. As you can smell it is. Then we better use that information, right? So hope you like that, can give you a little bit of inspiration. Go have a look at the masterclass because I really dived into not Schindler. I on purpose only read that later in depth. But anyway, it influenced me probably, and it's a way I feel very much connected with the way of playing. So anyway, hope this was of inspiration for you. If this is your first time here on the channel, love to have you subscribed as always. Hit the bell icon next to the subscription button so you stay on top of everything we do. Also the live streams, which a lot of interaction between us is great as always. And thank you for watching, sharing this video with your friends, and we see each other very soon again. Bye.